Hello and welcome to St. Louis History and Architecture. I'm your host, Nathan Jackson, and today we will be exploring the historic row houses in the Gate District neighborhood. While only a small percentage of its historic building stock remains, the Gate District is still home to a wide array of historic row houses from the 19th century. The area west of Jefferson Avenue was filled with large country estates in the middle of the 19th century. However, by the end of the 19th century, it had become a large and densely populated urban neighborhood, and it was during this period that many of these row houses featured were constructed. The area featured in today's video is known as the Gate District. This area is located between Grand and Jefferson Avenue and is just west of Lafayette Square. As the city center expanded out of the urban core, the Gate District transformed from a rural neighborhood into a densely populated urban neighborhood towards the end of the 19th century. As a result of this urban expansion, the Gate District had a wide array of different shops, businesses, schools, churches, and even a library by the early 20th century. Photographs show the busy streets and bustling neighborhood that existed in the area at this time. Lafayette Avenue was one of the major thoroughfares running through this neighborhood, and as a result, many of the shops, businesses, as well as the historic row houses were built on or around this street. This house on Lafayette Avenue, near California Avenue, was constructed in about 1870 in the Italianate style. The original owner of the home was William E. Rayner, who was a secretary of the Board of Public Schools in the city of St. Louis. In 1875, this row house was home to Frank H. Thomas of Sewell, Thomas and Wentworth, a law book publishing company. However, by 1877, Thomas had moved down the street to another home on Lafayette Avenue, and the home was now occupied by Thomas R. Reynolds of the Williams and Reynolds Abstract Company. Reynolds lived here until about 1882. The row which this house belonged to was one of the first in the neighborhood, as can be seen on the 1875 Compton Drive map. The 5 row houses were some of the first urban buildings in the neighborhood, as most of the earlier buildings were country estates. As of 2010, 3 of these 5 row houses still remained. However, the other 2 row houses unfortunately fell into a state of disrepair and have since been demolished. The remaining row house is one of the oldest buildings in the Gate District neighborhood and is a great example of Italianate-style architecture. The building features tall, thin, segmented arches for window openings, as well as a dentelated cornice and transom windows. While Italianate-style buildings are not exceedingly rare in the city of St. Louis, this row house provides a unique example of the style. This Second Empire-style row house at the corner of Lafayette and Jefferson Avenues was built in 1875 and is known as the Barr Block. The row house was built for William Barr of the William Barr Dry Goods Company, a predecessor to the 20th century famous Barr department stores. Barr had this row house constructed as an investment property in the neighborhood. In the late 19th century, this row house was home to many middle-class and upper-middle-class residents of the neighborhood. In 1876, Frank H. Thomas The law book publisher moved into the home from his previous home on Lafayette Avenue a few blocks up. He sent his son to Washington University from 1880 to 82 while he was living here. In 1881, this row house was home to Archibald Somerville, who was with the Missouri Glass Company. In 1883, Thomas R. Reynolds of the Abstract Company moved into one of the row houses in the bar block. His son, Thomas J. Reynolds, also lived here and during this time worked for the Missouri Pacific Railroad. In 1889, Walter H. Wiley, who worked for the Transcontinental Railroad, also lived at one of the residences in the row, along with his brothers William and Ernst, and they also worked for the railroad. By 1905, at least one of the buildings was being used as artist apartments, as Francis Salisbury and James Stewart were both listed in one of the residences from 1905 to 1907. By the late 20th century, the bar block had fallen into disrepair, and in the 1980s, it appears as though many units in the building were abandoned. However, the building was added to the National Register of Historic Places and has since been restored. Today, the bar block stands as one of the older examples of a Second Empire row house in the city, as well as one of the finer examples. The building was constructed with fine details, such as recessed brick entryways, as well as small brick decorative features. While many Second Empire-style homes exist in the city of St. Louis, only a few examples of Second Empire row houses that predate 1880 exist throughout the city. The buildings at Oregon and Lafayette Avenue were constructed in 1887 and feature both a mixed-use corner building as well as a number of row houses behind it. It was common for commercial buildings during this period to feature very ornate detailings throughout the facade, and this corner building at Oregon and Lafayette was no exception. St. Louis had a number of prominent cast iron manufacturers during this period, and this building features many wrought cast iron details up and down the front facade of the building. Over the years, it was home to a number of different businesses and had a lot of different tenants side by side at the same time. One of the original tenants of the building was the confectionery owned by Eliza and Edward Sappington. Alongside them was a butcher and a drugstore at different points. Later on in the 1890s, there was also a watchmaker and a bicycle shop in the building, and in the early 20th century, a tailor and a shoemaker were located in the building. The row houses on Oregon Avenue, which were also built in 1887, feature a mixture of both the Italianate and the Queen Anne styles, as they were built during a period during a transition between the two styles of architecture. The buildings featured tall and thin continuous window arches above the doorways, like would be seen in many Italianate-style buildings. They also feature a number of wider window arches, which can be seen on most Queen Anne buildings. During the late 19th century, a number of different people coming from various backgrounds lived in these row houses. In 1889, one of the residents was a man named Ennis Hopkins, who was an agent with the Mobile and Ohio Railroad. One of his neighbors was John P. Bull, and he worked for the U.S. Customs House and Post Office downtown. A third person living in the row house in 1889 was Edwin G. Merriam, who was an assistant to the Solicitor General of the Missouri Pacific Railroad. In the 1890s, Herman H. Ballman of the Ballman Music Company lived in the row house. Alongside him, there were also a number of other musicians as well as piano repairsmen who were living in the row at this time. Beginning in 1890, Marcella Proctor, who was a teacher, lived in the row house. She was a teacher through 1900 and then became the principal of Oak Hill School in the Tower Grove South neighborhood. By 1905, she was the principal of the Carondelet School, all while living in the row house. Other people such as laborers, telephone operators, and streetcar switches, among many other occupations, called these row houses home. These buildings denote an important period of time in the history of St. Louis architecture, denoting when the Italianate style transitioned into the Queen Anne style, as both of the styles are seen here. While many buildings in St. Louis have Italianate style features or Queen Anne style features, very few buildings have influences from both styles in the same design. The homes at the corner of Rutger and Ohio Street are more typical examples of later period flat-roofed Italianate style homes being constructed in 1887. They featured the tall, thin brick window arches above each of the windows and also a quarried limestone foundation. These homes also feature the signature stylistic cues of the flat roof Italianate style, one of them being the bracketed wooden cornice at the top of the roof line. Like many of the homes in the northern part of the Gate District neighborhood, these row houses were home to more working class and middle class residents. One of the first residents of the row houses was a man named Frederick Bruning, who was a carpenter, and he lived in the home in 1887. Frederick Dow, a streetcar switch, lived in the home from 1893 to 1902. Other residents of the home included butchers and bakers as well. From 1892 to 1910, a fireman named George Daly lived in the home. At some point in the early 1900s, Daly switched careers from being a fireman to a police officer. Another fireman named John J. Shaughnessy also lived in the row house during the 1890s. These flat-roofed Italianate-style row homes are typical of the styles of buildings that would have been constructed for working-class and middle-class residents during the 1880s. Two homes near Lafayette and Nebraska Avenues would have been more upper-middle-class examples of the flat-roof Italianate style of buildings. These buildings feature ornate limestone detailings as well as a bracketed wooden cornice which adorns the roofline, just like most Italianate-style buildings. One of these more upper-middle-class Italianate-style homes was the residence of Dr. Augustus Schott, who was a physician in the neighborhood. His next-door neighbor was Thomas C. Barron, who worked for the Union Depot Railroad. These two buildings were constructed in 1889, right at the tail end of the popularity of the Italianate style. It also marked the end of the popularity of the limestone fronted facades on wealthy people's homes. At this point, many homes featured terracotta brickwork for decoration as opposed to the limestone fronted facades which had been popular in the prior 2 decades. However, despite the changing architectural tastes at the end of the 1880s, the flat-roofed Italianate-style homes that were constructed during this period still featured elaborately decorated limestone front facades. A little further up the road, at the corner of Lafayette and Michigan Avenue, is a large row of limestone-fronted Second Empire homes that were constructed in 1885. These row houses were also built for upper-middle-class residents of the neighborhood. By the mid to late 1880s, the mansard roofs on Second Empire homes had transformed from the highly curved, flared mansards of the 1860s and 1870s into more straight and vertical mansard roofs, as you would see in the later 1880s. In 1887, many of the residents of the home were upper middle class families, such as George W. Woodworth, a commissions merchant. Also living at the home at this time was Vaughn S. Colbert, who was a salesman for Samuel Couples Woodenware Company. In another of the row houses lived Bertram Cribben, who was a lawyer. In 1889, Thomas Whiteman, who worked for the J. McLean Medicine Company, lived at the home. Next door lived Emil Schwertman, who was president of his own toy company at the time. During the late 19th century, the row house was home to many other people of various different backgrounds, including a physician, a professor, and a railroad worker, as well as, in the early 20th century, a man who worked for the U.S. Customs House and Post Office downtown. This is one of the larger row house examples of the city's numerous Second Empire style homes. Next door to the Second Empire row houses were 3 Romanesque Revival style brick homes that were constructed in 1892. Towards the late 1880s and early 1890s, the Second Empire and the Italianate styles gave way to Romanesque Revival and Queen Anne style buildings, such as these townhomes here, which featured wide brick and stone arches, gabled roofs, and brick terracotta detailing. In 1894, in one of the homes lived Isaac Copperlick, who was a cashier for the Bly and Singer Cloak Company. From 1894 to 1897, the middle home with the ornate terracotta brickwork lived Frederick C., Frederick G., and Richard H. Blank, who all worked for the Cyrus Blank Tea and Coffee Company on the downtown riverfront. With their gabled roofs and chimneys, these 3 buildings together provide an interesting addition to the streetscape of Lafayette Avenue. While all 3 of these row houses were constructed together at the same time in 1892, each one has a slightly different front facade with different terracotta brickwork and details present. Despite not being a major tour destination such as Lafayette Square, Soulard, or the Central West End, the Gate District still has quite a rich history and it features many historic row houses. Thank you for watching St. Louis History and Architecture. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share. And stay tuned for more videos coming soon.